procedures to follow. We have additional standards that are based, or that standards that are used in that practice. We have a way to do the quality control, and of course also a way, or a structured way of how to document the results so that they are actually comparable, as I mentioned before. Yeah, so the GOOS endorsed practice, which is one of these, and then endorsed practice means that an multi-institutional expert panel has looked at these practices, has defined them as the current known best working method within the community, and so this is also a very strict and peer-reviewed process. And an endorsed practice is very, very close to what you can achieve as a practice in terms of in the OBPS world. Let's put it that way. All right. So one example of a practice that y'all might know is just how to fold a boat. So I think everybody has a way to fold an origami boat, right? Or at least we had as a kid. There are so many different ways to do that. The question is, which one is the most and the best, and the which one floats the best, which one is better is easier to fold, and so on, right? So you'll have a whole bunch of different methods. How to find out which one is the best is just a way of how community does it. Here's one example. This also can be a practice. There is not much of a description. It shows the process of how to do it, right? So this is as easy as it can get, but it's very relatable. You can see how this, how a best practice could evolve. Eventually, you'll write it down. Eventually, you'll have a measurement. You'll have an idea of how to test it. So maybe you'll even have the different ways of which pool you have to put it in, and what the wind strength needs to be for it to actually float, and to test it out for how long it takes to sink. So this is just an example. Obviously, you know that there are many ways, and probably none could be best unless we define it as a community. All right. So what can we expect from a best practice? First one, we can expect the trust, right? So the question is, how often has this method been tested? So is it mature enough? Did we find its drawbacks? Did we find out where it works really well, where it doesn't? We have a link to an originator. So this also plays into the trust. So we know who creates it, right? Who has done the work on this, who has defined the process. And that creates a trust, because we are, especially the ocean community, I want to say, is fairly small in a sense of we know people, we know the names. So if we know that name that best practice has been originated from, there is a higher sense of trust in that it's actually working. A practice, or a best practice, follows the FAIR principles, and I'm sure you've heard this already. I think Piotr talked about this yesterday or 2 days ago as well, within the more of the standards world. So I don't need to tell you about this. A best practice expectation would be the quality of the documentation. So it'll include that it's understandable. So it's written in a way so that it can be understood by others who are maybe not following that process in very detail, or don't have a PhD in that specific area. And it should be reproducible, especially depending on the maturity of the practice. It should be reproducible without any prior knowledge in that specific process. It should be affordable. So it shouldn't be a custom-made, space-proof equipment that you need to know, that you need to use. It should be something that is fairly available and widely available for the community, to also make sure that it's reproducible. As mentioned, it is a community effort. So we are expecting this from best practices. It is a bottom-up approach, so it's basically community defines it. We know that it will not remain the same forever. So with people working on it, doing research, doing experimentation engineering, we know that practices evolve, and that's a really, really good thing. And we know that there will be updates over and over and over again. My clicker doesn't really work that well. So it is it is open to comments and contributions from new or expert users. And this is also something very important, is that it's not a set and done aspect. If somebody has feedback or comment, then it can go into that practice. And it should, and that's also part of the definition, it should be reach the originator, and the originator can comment on that, can update it, and so on. So there's always a way of feedback and interaction. One thing that I want to mention here, especially because we are a broad community, it's hard it's often complex to identify what is best, right? So for one thing, that for one person this might be best, for the other one this might be best. It's also all a matter of definition. All right. So I already talked a little bit about the different maturities and evolution of a practice. Here you have it on a nice sheet. In very short terms, it obviously starts with formation. So a practice is an ad hoc and has little documentation. So it's just, somebody thinks about a way to do something, does it, writes down a little bit on a piece of paper, and has results that are favorable for them. That is, in the sense of like they are as accurate as expected and also helpful for their job, right? So that will be the formation of a practice. Now you have an emerging practice that is repeatable. So it's defined, it's better defined, let's put it that way, and it may be documented. It's also repeatable by the process creator. So if I created the process, if I wrote it down and had an ad hoc process that for a very specific method or for a very specific goal, and I can repeat it, it would graduate into an emerging practice, and it is repeatable by myself because I know the environment, I know the tools I used, and so on. I may have written something down, but nothing spectacular, right? A good practice is defined and documented. That means it is formally defined. It has a goal. It has some specifics with it. It has, let's say, a metadata catalog to it, or a metadata in of that documentation. It's generally openly available for others to use, and can be replicated independently by others. However, we're not expecting that they can be replicated just off the bat. They should be possibly replicated from people that have knowledge in that or similar processes. So that's one thing, that you have the community of a very specific process. Those people might be able to replicate it. Others who are not very much in that space might not. So that's where a good practice ends. Then broadly adopted, you have a better practice. So that means that they are widely adopted by multiple institutions. So they have standardized formats, they have comprehensive metadata, they might have DOIs assigned. So also they're findable on the network of publications. Some documents documents and the metadata are also machine actionable, so that somebody can do a broader search on it, and you can find them and you can filter them on a catalog. And of course, one of the most important things is that once they are better practice, they can be replicated with no prior experience in that process. So somebody, I would assume, if it's an ocean best practice or an ocean better practice, that somebody from the ocean sector can replicate that practice without having to have a PhD in that specific field. And of course, the best of all, a mature best practice would be endorsed. And as I mentioned, endorsement for us means that there was an expert panel that comes from multiple institutions who review this. It's a very crucial process that have a formal adoption or a formal endorsement for that. That also includes that they have diagnostic tools, that there are feedback loops involved, as I mentioned before, within the community as well. They are supporting continuous improvement. So if somebody finds out that there is a better way to do that, that they would improve and include that in that. If there's a specific aspect that could be improved. And of course, there's also training and sustainability thought of, and they can be embedded into advanced information infrastructures, which I'll talk about in a minute as well. All right, so the endorsement, I already mentioned that. Just as a summary, really, it identifies the key community practices. It has been repeatedly requested by the community, so that's something that is also very important, that if there are practices that are repeatedly requested by the community, then eventually they will be going through the endorsement process, because it's obvious that it has a high value to the community as such. Of course, endorsements help to promote the creation and promotion of other best practices. And last but not least, there is a possibility for convergence, so that different practices will come together into one bigger practice of sorts. All right. Where do we find practices? How do we make sure that we get practices? And you see the value chain here of observations. Everywhere we can find practices and describe them and develop them into better best practices. That starts with, if you think about the observations of ocean data, it starts with the requirements. Requirements for a specific observation can be already a practice, because you've written down the requirements. They might change eventually. They might be adaptable to different measurements and observations, but there is a possibility of a practice there, and so on. It goes through the whole value chain through observations, deployment, and the maintenance. So within the whole process, you have practices for outputs. So, for example, how is the output structured? How should they be presented? Which ways do we have them to store data and information? How is the product that comes out usable for others? All of these can be practices. And of course, you can also have a practice on the impacts and also the measurement of impacts and the delivery of services to the end user. So, for example, visualizations, right? So how can it show the outputs in a way that they are usable and helpful? Okay, so we are now going into a little bit of a segue here into the Ocean Best Practices system. For those who haven't seen it yet, Ocean Best Practice System, or the Ocean OBPS, you can find it at oceanbestpractices.org, is an online platform that has basically that is a catalog of best practices in ocean sciences. You can see that there. You can search for practices. So we have a search engine in the back. You can submit new practices, and there are different programs that help the community in developing those practices. In addition to that, there's also a lot of training and capacity building going on. We'll have our workshop, our Ocean Best Practices workshop in October, where Iliad will also be featured, of course, as being part of the ocean community there. The vision is really to have agreed and broadly adopted methods across ocean research, operations, and applications. It really ranges very, very broadly between basic ocean sciences, all the way to the application of tools and products, to make sure that the community has a certain understanding of what's going on. Yeah. So the Ocean Best Practice System, this is a little bit of a diagram on how it's run. So the Ocean Best Practice System has a whole bunch of participating organizations and programs that contribute to the database, that also help run the organization or run the system. Some of them might seem very familiar here. We have the users are in the heart of the system, so it's really those people who are looking for and contributing practices. They are the ones that the whole system is tailored for. One aspect of that is that we have frontiers research topics in ocean sciences that is also related to the OBPS. So a lot of the practices that are in there you can find, or parts of these are in the journal, and the journal comes back into the system. We obviously provide support and training, I already mentioned that, and we are also in very strong collaboration with IOD in terms of long-term repositories, and we have, as I mentioned, semantic search, discovery, and so on. Now, we are talking about digital twins. You might have seen a simple architecture diagram like this. And this is the same thing as with the value chain before. In digital twins of the ocean, there are a lot of practices that could be described, right? In all stages of developing a digital twin, from data collection to storage to the analytics to the visualization, everywhere in there are a lot of practices. We are using a lot of standards to get there, but how we're applying those standards, how we're developing the different aspects and components, that's something that could potentially become a best practice. And that's also our aspiration, is that we are going to define those practices and make sure that others who want to develop digital twins of the ocean have a base to start off from. And in that case, much more on the technology side, but still part of the ocean and very ocean specific. Now you might ask how best practices can help digital twin development. And I mean, there is a whole bunch of, especially on OBPS, on how this can support it. OBPS as the catalog, there are and might be already a lot of different aspects on the digital twin, especially also on the data collection, data cleansing, data development aspects of it, right? OBPS can expand the knowledge transfer between the ocean sciences and the digital twin world, knowing that digital twins also is a lot of computer science in the background, where there is that interdisciplinary aspect to be considered. Computer science engineers might not know the intricacies of ocean bathymetry and whatnot, and the other way around. Ocean experts might not exactly know the best way to write an algorithm for highly efficient calculations of simulations, right? So there is that intersection and that knowledge transfer. Of course, OBPS can also help with the efficiency, provide resources as a repository, provide the training. It also serves as a platform in the sense of bringing people together. And of course, it offers a suite of relevant metadata that provide the context as well. I've mentioned this before, best practices for creating a digital twin. This is a list that can potentially happen, and some of it is already ongoing. Especially also finding out the societal impact of best practices, of digital twins as a best practice. There's a whole bunch that we can discuss and talk about, and I'm happy to hear your thoughts about this in the discussion as well. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Yes, if you ever find yourself in the position that you want to create a best practice, or you want to create a practice, this would probably be the best way to start. There is a best practice, how to develop best practices, which has been written by that list of people. I mentioned a few of them before. So feel free to go there and find that. It's a manual about how to write a best practice. It also includes the steps, which I think are fairly clear. You want to confirm the need. You're developing a working group that can be as big and small as you see fit in the practice world. You develop the content, you draft it, and you release it on OEPS or otherwise. And you'll invite feedback. Eventually, there will be revisions, and Ocean Best Practices will support you in that, all of that practice. To make it a little bit easier, there are also templates for best practices. So again, there's a best practice structure that has been developed on how to describe these, and you can follow this as a more of a task list, and then it's described fairly quickly. Now, I know Piotr has already talked about this, or has talked about standards before, and I just wanted to mention here the difference between best practices and standards. Can I ask if anybody can point me or has an idea where the difference is between those two?
Anyone? Differences between best practices and standards?
I mean, I can guess, but I do not really know.
Yeah, give it a try.
A standard is like we follow a protocol, but something like a protocol. But the best practice, you can be more flexible based on what you have. You can adjust the things.
Okay, you didn't hear that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that goes into a very correct direction. Thank you. Anybody else? Otherwise, I'll solve. Okay, so one of the biggest challenges, the biggest.
We have a guest here.
Okay, go ahead.
Like the standards is the minimum, and best practices is like the best idea that we have to follow.
Have you heard that?
Yes, standard is a minimum, and the best practice is more of a broader community. Okay. Yes. Also correct to a certain extent. I'll also explain the minimum in a minute. Okay. I will solve. So one of the defining perspectives for a best practice is that they evolve from individually developed methods, and a practice transitions to a best practice, endorsed practice, and then a standard. That doesn't mean that all practices become a standard or all standards become a practice. One important differentiation is that a best practice is a bottom-up approach. So somebody defines it, and then it's adopted by the community. A standard is defined as a documented set of guidelines, specifications, or criteria created through a defined process under a standards organization. So ISO, OGC, or IEEE. They are likely to be built on related best practices. Now, you were right in the sense of a standard is a minimum. The standard is normally it's a specification that the process has to be followed, and there are normative aspects that if you don't follow this one, you cannot say that you're complying with that standard. That as strict doesn't exist in a best practice, because you can say you followed the best practice, but you changed XYZ and it's still applicable, right? So this is what I think I understood what you mean with the minimum. Now, standard processes are also very much strict and well facilitated. Let's put it that way. Let's say it in a nice way. So standards start from somebody has or one or many organizations or people have a very specific need for a standard. Then a group is called together, and that group develops in a consensus-based process the standard. And the output after 3 to 5 years is a finalized document that describes a standard, and it cannot be easily revised. So it's not as, and then that's exactly what you mentioned before as well in the audience. The best practice can be changed fairly easily, where a standard is set for a longer period of time, and it also holds this higher consensus-based approach in mind. So a standard is not created and if there are objections to that standard. Whereas a best practice, of course, is trying to come up from a more of a, build things, move fast and break things kind of approach. Make sure that you do it is, if it works, then describe it. If other people think that's good as well and they can repeat it, then it's becoming slowly a practice, of course. And then that's what I said, is a practice can become a standard eventually, and it can be codified into a standard for the future. And then other organizations can say, okay, we are using that standard, and that means a lot if you have a product that can fulfill these standards, especially. And that's one of the things that is important, is that standards and best practices ensure the consistency and the uniformity in how things are done. And I think that's the most important part, and the most important takeaway from this slide here is both have the same objective. They're just developed differently, right? They provide a common language, set rules that everybody can follow. In the standards, if you want to be complying with a standard, you actually have to follow them. In the best practice, you don't necessarily have to, but of course, if you're deviating too much from the best practice, it might not be comparable again to what others have done. So yeah, I already mentioned this, a standard specification of procedures. I mentioned the consensus finding one. Funny or interesting, not that funny, unfortunately. Example was what you see there, the standard for fire hose connections. This is one of the earliest standards in the US. The big Baltimore fire of 1900 something destroyed a lot of houses. The fire was that big that the local fire department couldn't handle it, and they called in enforcements all the way from basically down to New York, only to find out that New York has different fire hose connectors, and they couldn't really help because they couldn't connect to the water outlets, which was then one reason why the standards started to develop, in the sense that, okay, maybe we should all in the United States, we should all have the same connector so that we can help each other out. Right, so this is a very, very clear example. Standards way more also from, power plugs, that they exactly are the right size. They have to conform with a whole bunch of security measures. So that's also what it says there: functionality, safety, compatibility, so that even if you are traveling from Spain to Germany, you still know that these are the same power plugs. They're still on 220 volts, and so on. So also interoperability. Okay, consensus finding I mentioned, and standard organizations follow that rigorous process. This is important, of course, because they are then the ones responsible that the standards are also kept in line, and that they are kept updated if necessary. For example, just from my perspective, in IEEE, IEEE has that very volunteer process. ISO is more government driven. Let's put it that way. I can go into detail if that's of interest later. Now, because we are talking about digital twins of the ocean, there are a whole bunch of organizations working on digital twins very, very broadly. For example, ISO has their Committee 41 that's on IoT and digital twins. They just released the ISO standard 30173 on concepts and terminology of digital twins or digital twin use cases. However, just for reference, these are much more looking at digital twins as a very, very broad topic, also including digital twins of sustainable of cities, digital twins of manufacturing, and so on. Originally, of course, also from transport and whatnot. But they have AI, ISO has other ones. I don't need to talk about OGC. I think Piotr did a good job on that one already. And then you have a few other organizations like the Digital Twin Association and Digital Twins Consortium that are also pushing towards more of a de facto standard and I guess practices in that sense, also looking much more at manufacturing. And then within the Iliad project, and I think that's the most important for me, is of course we have the OAM, the Ocean Information Model, which is a standard of sorts. It has not gone through the process of the standardization just yet, but eventually it probably will it become a de facto standard for the ocean, for ocean sciences information. And lastly, I will go into this in a little bit. I am running a recommended practice working group for the development of digital twins of the Earth. So if anybody's interested in that, do let me know. It's currently a study group. That means that we are thinking about how we can set up the standard process, how we can create that standard in the working group and the scope of all of this. This slide is a little bit outdated. It has been submitted. The decision is still pending due to a few formalized factors. We'll hope that in September we'll get the okay to start that working group under the IEEE SA. What the goal is really to describe the development process of digital twins of the Earth, including also the dependencies, everything from how to engineer this and what different components could be. So you'll see that here, this is very much, I think Bente already mentioned this as well, sometime in the summer school, that we are trying to make it easier for people to develop digital twins of the ocean, and we are developing a practice for this, or we're writing it up as a practice, and this practice will eventually have an impact into also a standard, and the standard of how to develop that digital twin that others can then use and work from that. Of course, there's also a whole bunch of substandards that are possible. Again, it could be a practice first and then become a standard. It might never become a standard, but stay as a practice. Anything from visualization to legal, ethical aspects, architecture, quality assurance of digital twins, anything that is possible that we're developing. If you are interested in the standardization aspects of that, you can definitely email me. Here are my email addresses. You can join the group and contribute as well. I will stop there, and thank you so much for giving me the chance to talk, and I'm happy to stay around for a little bit and have any questions and discussions.
Yeah, thank you. Do we have any questions? No? Maybe I have one. Is there any standards? Because here we have many people working on digital twins of the ocean or starting to work on digital twins of the ocean. And I was asked before if there's anything for data management plans. So do you know any standards or for data management plans that are maybe specifically applied to digital twins of the ocean? Or do you know where to find them?
I do not. And I think that would be a great perspective within the Iliad project to develop something like that. But I think I want to say that I read this on Discord that Iliad does have a few data management plan aspects, and they are currently being developed. So I want to say that Iliad might be one of the best places to get these this very specific data management plan for digital twin of the oceans. Of course, more generally, I would assume that there are ways and standards and practices on how to do the data management. Specifically for the ocean, I'm not aware that it exists, and I believe that would be something that would be very worthwhile to create as well.
Yeah, thank you. And how do you deal, for instance, with the secrecy on the industry? Because personally, I'm working with offshore renewable energies, and since, for instance, for offshore wind, because it's a very nascent technology, there's a lot of secrecy. How do you deal with this?
That is a very, very good question. So I mean, a standard in that sense, and also I guess a practice. A practice is only published if the originators want to publish it, right? So that's the first thing. It's like if you don't want to publish it because it has proprietary value to you, then you probably don't want to publish it as of yet. At a point where you can see a benefit for you, if you're a company and you see a benefit for your company in sharing that process so that others can reuse it and then you benefit from them you reusing it, then you're probably going to be you will be very hesitant in what you're sharing. So you'll be very thinking a lot about this. But of course you want to share the process so much that you can benefit from others using it as well. In a standard, that's a little bit different because by joining a working group that is developing something on that field or in that very specific field, you're already aware that others are doing something in that direction. And then your question must be, do I want to influence what the standard will say? Or do I want to keep my own and then basically be able to say, I'm not following that standard. I have my better way to do that. And of course, it also depends a lot on the interoperability and intercomparability of things. If you develop a technical device that can do something much better, then you might actually not want this standardized, right? You might want to have the outputs of that standardized. For example, when you're saying, hey, I'm getting XYZ better data with my method, then you could say, okay, we're standardizing the outputs of that so that others can also output in that same format and structure, but the actual components in your toolbox still stays a black box and it stays proprietary. And that is a very tough, it's a very hard decision to make. But it obviously especially when you're doing this as a company, you're doing it out of a business reasoning, right? You're saying, does it help me more to share and to participate in the standardization and practices efforts, or does it help me more to keep quiet and just earn a lot of money before somebody else copies me? And then of course you have the intellectual property parts in there. The standards processes have quite a good safeguards around this. So for example, you're also, even if you are a few companies working on the same standard, you're not allowed to talk about intellectual properties if it hasn't been cleared. All the patents need to be very transparently brought forward if there are patents that a standard could be infringing on. And of course, there's just general safeguards in terms of, like, you can't talk about prices of your products, you can't talk about your market shares or splitting up market regions. All of this is very strictly prohibited within the standardization processes. Of course, because practices, since we're talking about practices, aren't as stringently and rigorously controlled, there is a chance that this could happen. But at the same time, since standards come out of the community, there's a very, very low chance that something like that would happen anyway.
Thank you. So do we have any more questions now? Okay, so thank you, Sigmund.
All right, thank you.